Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Engineering the Quantum Leap That Drug Development Needs. This webinar is part of the 5th Annual Drug Discovery and Development Virtual Conference. I am Marie Stone of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots. Now let's get started. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to first participate by communicating with other attendees using our new live chat feature during the presentation. You can find the live chat located at the right of your screen. You can also participate by submitting as many questions as you would like during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Send. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. If you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, click on the Help Desk button located at the bottom of your screen within the navigation bar or from the lobby. Finally, as a reminder, this presentation is educational and offers free continuing education credits. Click on the Continuing Education Credits link located in the Abstract window below the Presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. I'll now present today's speaker, Michelle Longmire, MD, CEO, and co-founder, Medable. For a complete biography on our speaker, please visit the Biography tab at the left of your screen. Dr. Longmire, you may now begin your presentation.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for your time today, and very appreciative to be here and have the opportunity to talk about something that I'm incredibly passionate about, which is how we enable effective therapies to reach patients faster. I do wish we had the actual solution to the quantum leap, but today it will really be a conversation about what are some of those strategies that we could leverage to really accelerate the development of new therapies. So, we know that drug development is a very complex process. I think we're at a point in time scientifically which is just so exciting, as we've seen with things like the mRNA vaccines, that science, the scientific kind of backbone or foundation for new therapies is increasing at an exponential rate. That science has never flourished to the degree that it is today. And the question really becomes, how do we harness these advancements in basic science to take it to the next level, which is really effectively treating human disease? And when you look at kind of the path to cures or new treatments, I would argue that the biggest bottleneck isn't in the discovery of new potential molecular entities or drugs, but it's actually the process by which we can test these therapies for safety and efficacy and understand whether they're actually viable to improve human health, what we call clinical drug development. And so, what do we do in a world where the opportunities are increasing at an exponential rate, but our ability to test whether these therapies are effective is the major bottleneck? And that's what we'll be talking about today. How do we remove the bottleneck for clinical development so that we can more aggressively get therapies to the many, many people who are waiting for something better? So, it's pretty interesting when you look at drug development and where we are today. Just some interesting facts on this and why we do need this kind of quantum leap approach is that today a single drug costs what it would have taken to develop 90 drugs 70 years ago. So, despite the fact that we've had incredible breakthroughs in technology over this timeline, clearly if this is the case, we're not fully harnessing what technology brings to the table to reduce the cost of drug development. As we know that it takes about $2.6 billion to take a drug from in animal through human testing to potentially get an approval so that it can be leveraged at scale for the treatment of human disease. And we know that, we only have treatments for about 10% of human ailments. So clearly we need to think about what can we do to truly accelerate the development of new medicines? where are the untapped opportunities to leverage technology and innovation in the clinical part of this, the in-human testing part of this, so that we can really remove that bottleneck. And it's important to take a look at the barriers that are in the development process. We know cost is one of the major barriers. Cost is a barrier because, of course, we operate with limited resources, and when costs are extremely high, you can only take so many shots on goal, and it basically forces drug developers to only test a certain smaller number of potential therapies, while there may be many additional therapies that are unable to be tested simply because of the cost alone. We know that the timelines are extremely long. When you look at the entire kind of phase 1 through approval process, you're looking at about a 12-year timeline on average. Access to clinical research is an incredible barrier, and we know that this not only contributes to the long timelines, it also basically puts us in a position where the drugs that we're developing are often not fully reflective of the populations living with these conditions, because the participating population is a much smaller percentage of that total group, and often it doesn't represent the overall composition from a diversity perspective of who would receive the medicine post-approval. Additionally, we know that retention is a big challenge, right? When we've gone through all of the work and enabled someone to successfully enroll in a clinical trial, it's extremely disappointing when we're unable to retain people in the clinical trials. And we have to ask ourselves, how can we ensure that the clinical trial process is not only on par, but ideally superior to healthcare delivery itself? And what are the right kind of incentives and opportunities for us to align from a convenience perspective to ensure that people will want to not only enroll, but really remain in the clinical research process? Additionally, there is a huge disconnect between research and care. My background, I'm a physician scientist, and I trained in dermatology at Stanford, one of the leading research centers. And it's interesting, even in one of these, really world-class research centers, as a physician, clinical trials are not a part of the way that our physicians are trained, and it's not a part of the standard healthcare delivery, even when these institutions are known for their research. So you can imagine the disconnect between research and care in many of the community practices all over the world. We see an increasing complexity to the clinical trial protocols. And, the analysis of this suggests that this complexity is not always necessary, but that we're adding additional tests because tests exist, and we may not be focusing on what's really required in the most efficient way to determine safety and efficacy. And often, as we are developing our clinical trial protocols, we're layering in additional tests and additional requiring the protocols to answer additional questions that actually may not add to the overall ability to answer the safety and efficacy question, but does add to patient burden. The regulatory landscape is, of course, an important safety kind of infrastructure, and ensuring that we're doing what's right for patients and we're aligning to a way of working that ensures that safety. But also, the regulatory framework can be a limiter to the innovation and speed with which we would ideally pursue the development of new therapies. And the clinical sites, right? We know that clinical sites, again, myself as a physician, that it's very challenging as a physician to weave in the delivery of healthcare and executing research. And clinical site engagement is one of the things that we need to solve for when we look at how we're going to evolve drug development. So when we look at, what is the additional kind of layer around patients and how we could actually enable patients in the science itself to be more representative, it's pretty interesting when you look at the limited participation that we see across different groups and different demographics. So we know that less than 3% of eligible participants have access to clinical trials. We know that 11% of research sites fail to enroll a single patient. The number is much greater when you look at fail to hit enrollment targets as a whole. We know that the budgets for research in general are going down over time, but we're still in a position where these drugs and the approval of these medicines is so critical, as we've seen during the COVID pandemic, that our ability to get vaccines and really rapidly develop these vaccinations, it was really what's enabled us to make progress on our ability to reopen the world and society and ensure that we're limiting the damage that COVID-19 has had on human lives. So we need to look at how we're actually enabling inclusivity in the drug development process. When we have only 3% of eligible patients, we have to ask ourselves, what is the composition of that group? Even if it's only 3%, one, how do we get that number up? And two, what does that 3% look like? When we do, a double click on how representative our clinical trials are, we see that this is yet another fail point in the research efforts. That, largely clinical trial participants are Caucasian. We have underrepresentation of minority groups, and we often have underrepresentation of additional socioeconomic groups. So clearly, we need to be able to drive a drug development process that is radically different than where we are today. We need to be able to drive a drug development process that is faster, lower cost, more inclusive, and ultimately provides access and retention that is far beyond the status quo of what we're seeing today. So how do we get there? And again, I don't claim to have, the panacea, but I do think that innovation and what we have seen kind of in terms of technology leverage during the pandemic highlight some very promising technologies that we can leverage to start to solve these problems. So I would guess that many people in the audience, who are familiar with drug development, have heard of decentralized clinical trials. It's really essentially referencing a clinical trial methodology that removes the geographic barrier of participation by enabling more remote and community-based participation. Decentralized clinical trials are not new. They have been around really for several decades, but I think until the pandemic, there wasn't a forcing function to test out at scale some of the decentralized clinical trial methodologies. What we saw during the pandemic, as sites all over the world were impacted and we needed to close those clinics that were mid-flight in the development of some of the most critical medicines, really quickly the pharmaceutical industry looked to new technologies to solve this access problem at a time where there were really no other options. So within the last 2 years, we have seen acceleration, very meaningful acceleration of the adoption of decentralized clinical trials, where we're able to provide connectivity for patients outside of the walls of the clinical site for some portion of the data collection. And we're able to provide, in many cases, a hybrid model where that data is collected at certain points in person, but at other points remotely. I would say there's an additional arm to the decentralized clinical trial model, which is making it more community-centric, where we're really deconstructing the traditional research site, which might be very limited in its access point, to providing those investigators the reach for patients that actually are within the patient communities that they're living in, that the patients are living in. So this can look like engagement through retail pharmacies like a CVS or a Walgreens. It can also leverage local laboratories and local imaging centers versus, the patient who may live many hours from Stanford and otherwise would have to drive into Stanford to have all of that testing done. So it's not just about remote access. It's not just about this hybrid in-person and remote, but it's also about making clinical trials not centered around the site, but centered around the communities that patients are living in, so that you can make those access points often in person, but something more local to where the participants are actually living. And it's been exciting to see the adoption of new technologies into an industry and a process that has historically been very slow to adopt, and slow to adopt for good reasons. The barriers are high. The stakes are high. We know that the cost investment are tremendous. And in general, the pharmaceutical industry, is reluctant to take risk where there's not a clear benefit. Over the last 2 years, we've been able to, through the adoption of DCTs, really start to research where does that benefit for decentralized clinical trials exist. And I'll talk about that research here in a minute and what some of those outcomes look like. So decentralized clinical trials are an important step forward as we look at solving some of those core barriers around cost, timelines, access, potentially site engagement, even also looking at ways in which this can help us improve patient retention. So when we look at, what is the barrier to DCT adoption, we want to look at how that aligns with the barriers in the traditional drug development process and understand, are we really moving the needle? So the single greatest barrier that's been identified is really how we do this across the global regulatory landscape, where, as we're collecting data, countries have very different perspectives on what data can be collected remotely or in person, and also have different perspectives on what types of technologies should be utilized in the clinical research process. So one of the barriers that remains for decentralized clinical trials certainly is how to navigate the global regulatory framework, including things around endpoint data collection to data privacy. And these are really kind of local issues, but when you're trying to execute a global clinical trial protocol, you want to be able to standardize as much as possible so that your data set is standardized. And when we, have different policies and different approaches being applied to, say, France or China, it begins to introduce variation in how that research is executed. So the regulatory landscape remains one of the barriers and hurdles to overcome. We also need to look at how we can rewrite protocols in a decentralized clinical trial world. There are things that can be done that we have been able to show benefit from, such as remote consent, remote data collection. How are we actually adapting our protocols to harness that benefit? And then understanding, how we can enable sites to be leaders in decentralized clinical trials. How does that really work into the workflow for the physicians? And how do we make this something that improves site engagement, doesn't actually create another barrier for the sites themselves? So there are no doubt, as we look at decentralized clinical trials and the opportunity to conduct drug development in a more convenient and more accessible way for patients, there, of course, remain a number of barriers, some of which align with the traditional barriers of drug development, and others that are unique to decentralized clinical trials, such as remote endpoint collection, because of this new methodology. So let me move forward. I think it's an important question to ask, what do patients think of decentralized clinical trials? So patients actually really find that decentralized clinical trials are an appealing option. Now, we're early in the journey of really looking at the entire scope of the patient experience in DCT, because it's a fairly new methodology, and again, has only been adopted at scale in the last couple of years. But what we do see is that decentralized clinical trials can potentially really improve the patient experience. With that said, there's key things to take into consideration. Decentralized clinical trials may only be preferred in a certain subset of the protocol designs. We need to look at how are we motivating for participation if you have less contact with your physician. We need to look at, are there concerns and how does this compare from a dropout rate perspective to a traditional clinical trial? And then ultimately, what is the end-to-end patient journey when we have less contact at the site? So more questions that we're exploring on the patient experience. Interestingly, when we look at sites and what they think about decentralized clinical trials, there are a number of areas that they're looking critically at. What is the compensation model? What does How does this impact the overall investment in technology that the sites need to make? And this is some of the top two areas that sites find that are challenging in DCTs, but interestingly, the areas they find to be actually less challenging are the time to implement. Difficulty for participants to participate does not seem to be a big challenge. And they are finding that participant safety is also not among the top challenges for sites executing DCT. So, when we look at the challenge of drug development, we look at some of the traditional barriers, and decentralized clinical trials being something that essentially had to be leveraged during the pandemic. And now as we emerge from the pandemic, is DCT something that we are going to want to continue on the path of, as we look to develop new and innovative ways to remove those barriers to the development of new therapies? And I think that the answer is very interesting, and it, again, still early in the journey, but appears to be a resounding yes. And I say that because we just conducted a large research study or analysis with the Tufts Center for Drug Development, where we looked at the net present value of decentralized clinical trials. And we showed that in a phase 3 study that we could improve the overall, or we could provide a return of investment that was 14x greater than the initial investment made, so an ROI of 14x. And these benefits of DCT come from several key areas. And this is, again, kind of the inception point of this type of research. But we're showing a reduction in protocol amendments. We're showing an improvement in patient retention. And we're showing a reduction in cycle time that is meaningful. And the combination of those three factors is what's leading to a 14x return on investment in a phase 3 trial that is implementing DCTs. Now, what's interesting about this research that it was conducted by Ken Getz and Joe DeMasi is it looked at decentralized clinical trial data in partnership with Medable, where we implemented a modular approach to decentralized clinical trials. So what this means is that we're taking a protocol and we're saying, where are the levers that technology could be applied here to improve essentially to remove the barriers that were highlighted earlier. How can we improve patient access? How can we reduce the regulatory barriers through things like reduction in protocol amendments? How can we improve not only access, but patient retention? How can we improve site engagement? So each one of these clinical trials that was analyzed, it was actually leveraging a different combination of technologies that were purpose-built, a fit for that protocol to address some of those barriers. And what's exciting about that research with the full kind of peer-reviewed publication forthcoming is that we are showing we're meaningfully moving the needle on drug development by implementing these new technologies. And again, I wish it was the quantum leap. I wouldn't call it the quantum leap, but a 14x return on investment does suggest that there is a meaningful improvement and that there's also a meaningful potential reduction in cost. Now, the research that was done in partnership with Tufts really was, I think, scratching the surface of the overarching opportunity to look at net present value of the decentralized clinical trial approach. It was really looking at largely the kind of financial return on investment through those three pillars that I mentioned: cycle time reduction, protocol amendment, number of protocol amendments, and retention. The next phase of this research will really begin to look at that inclusivity and diversity of the patient population in greater depth. And we'll also look at ability to reduce cycle time through other mechanisms beyond the patient retention piece of this. And I think that if we look at the impact to diversity and inclusivity, that will be a really important area to compare to baseline, where we know, as I showed in this earlier slide, where we're really underperforming. So the question will become, can decentralized clinical trials really provide an avenue for more diversity and more inclusivity in clinical trials? And if it does, today, that's fantastic. If it doesn't, how can we leverage this type of innovation to achieve those outcomes? So this is kind of the next phase of research that Medable will be doing in partnership with, or my company will be doing in partnership with the Tufts Center for Drug Development. We also recently pioneered a partnership with CVS to be able to provide access through retail pharmacies with the objective of really driving more inclusivity and more access for all types of patients in all communities. So this will be, I think, an important input to our analysis of the ability for decentralized clinical trials to potentially move the needle on some of those core barriers, such as inclusivity, such as access, patient retention. Areas that we definitely have a lot of continued work on, I would say, are in that global regulatory landscape. Today, I think there are more unanswered questions than answered questions when you look at remote endpoint capture, specifically around primary endpoints. And when you look at the global data privacy landscape, there is a lot of differences in kind of a perspective approach and regulations around what data can be collected and how, and including things like, can you reset your own password through an application that also collects health information, something that is unfortunately currently very, very hard to do in geographic areas like France, where there is more regulatory separation between patient identifiable information and health information. So really looking at, how can we establish a best practice that's the best for patients while ensuring those really important, very important additional areas of value for patients, such as data privacy. So these are areas that I think the community of decentralized clinical trials are actively working on. We work closely with a group called DTRA, or the Decentralized Clinical Trial Research Alliance, to help drive cross-company collaboration with the regulators to say, here are some of the big barriers, let's work on this together. And through that, I think we'll be able to even, really address some of the barriers that are unique to DCT more head on. So it's an exciting time for decentralized clinical trials. It's an exciting time, I think, to be in clinical drug development. I think if we fast forward 5 years, in our ability to not only leverage technology, but then measure the impact of that technology, which I think is really important because that should then evolve your strategy. We should see, I believe, a really meaningful improvement in some of the biggest challenges in drug development. And what excites me the most is to really get to a point where the development of our therapies has a set of data that is really reflective of the people who will, really benefit the most from these medications once they're more widely available, once they're commercialized. So I think the inclusivity piece and the access piece have tremendous potential for improvement through the decentralized clinical trial methodology. With that, I would love to open it to questions. I hope that was a useful overview of an exciting new area of innovation in drug development, and we'll go over to the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Longmire, for your informative presentation. We will now start the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen. Let's get started. Our first question is, are available technologies really mature enough to make impact on clinical research?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say before the pandemic, the utilization wasn't at the scale that it is at now. Medable, our company, who's one of several, in this area, has now conducted over 300 decentralized clinical trials. And the definition of decentralized there would be utilization of one of the core technologies to provide remote access to one of the key parts of the clinical research process. So it could be telemedicine, it could be remote consent, it could be, the use of remote data collection via outcome assessments or connected sensors. But with over 300, that was the data that was leveraged for the Tufts evaluation of net present value of DCT. And that's where we showed a 14x improvement, or 14x ROI on the investment for a phase 3 clinical trial. So it is, I would say we're at a point where we can say, yes, these technologies are mature and that we have a pretty strong indication of what that investment will provide back for drug developers.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, what do you think will be the biggest area of impact that technology will have on the life cycle of drugs?
I think that the biggest impact will really be around this inclusivity piece. You know, when you look at a drug like Vioxx, right, and you have to ask yourself, well, how did we get to a state where once a drug was commercialized, we discovered that, it was very dangerous in some patients. I think that it's clear that our drug development process needs to have inclusivity, and it needs to be inclusive around different demographic and ethnic and racial groups, but it also needs to begin to take into consideration additional layers that we may not be considering, such as additional layers around genetic diversity that I think isn't always reflective through what would be more of a phenotypic categorization, of different types of people. And I think when you combine, those elements and you look at decentralized clinical trials, we should really be able to develop a more robust set of research participants that are reflective of the people who will ultimately benefit the most from those medications, and should also help us understand in the research process who are the people that benefit the most from this medication. So to me, I think that the primary area of benefit, one of them will certainly be, one of the areas that we're really looking to, move the needle on is around inclusivity and diversity of clinical trial participation, with the goal of developing, therapies that are more effective at scale.
Great. Next question. Where do you think innovation in clinical research will be in the next 5 years?
Well, I really envision, especially as we make partnerships with companies like CVS, that research will really be a care option. And I think we're trying to build a world where, when you think about your own life and you're like, okay, I'm struggling with psoriasis, or I'm struggling, with, you name it, Parkinson's disease, people have a very easy path to new therapies that are in development today. I think right now people are interested in therapies that are in development, but it's very unclear how they get access. And I would say then there's an entirely larger group of people who aren't even aware of this as an option. So, in 5 years, I believe we could build a world where everyone thinks about investigational treatments as a first line option, or certainly an option and that would be accessible, and where they would have information at the tips of their fingers and be able to enroll in clinical trials to access those medicines, just as easy as it is to go to the pharmacy and pick up your asthma medication.
Great. Thank you. Next question. What what is the role of organ on chip for decreasing the cost and increasing of speed of drug discovery in a practical manner?
Yeah, the organ on chip concept, I think, is really, really exciting. This is basically saying, how can we create synthetic models of human biology where you really reduce, then ideally you remove a lot of the safety risk, because you're testing both the safety and the efficacy in this kind of synthetic organ model. Coming out of Stanford, where I worked in a lab that, really leveraged, models, synthetic models, or, biological models of human skin, I see this has tremendous tremendous potential. I think in certain areas it's a bit farther away from a real world application, but there are certain areas like in dermatology where I think we'll see this model leveraged sooner than later.
Great. Thank you. Next question. To reduce the time spent on drug discovery, can some of the phases be merged to achieve this?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and when you look at areas of need where, say, people do not have other therapeutic options, it makes a lot of sense to start to converge the phases, because you really want to reduce the timelines and you want to provide the therapy as an option as soon as ideally you have any real data around efficacy, if there's really no other option, or if patients say, hey, I know that efficacy data isn't there yet, but again, I have no better option. So there has been a movement to provide access to these therapies with consent at, say, a phase 2B, where there may be no other options. And certainly some of the more innovative protocols or drug development models will begin to merge phase 1 and phase 2, or phase 2 and phase 3. So it's an important thing to be able to do in certain therapeutic areas, and certainly it's something we're seeing being done more often.
Great, thank you. It looks like we have time for one more question. Where do you see pharmacogenomics playing a role in clinical trials?
Yeah, I think, again, when asked about where will we be in 5 years, I think, we need to not only provide access to patients, that, ensuring we have the right diversity from a type perspective, where we're also really taking genotype into consideration. So, genotype is in our, the underlying kind of genomic diversity is far greater than what we have, from a phenotype perspective. So I think this is going to become an increasing, an area of increasing interest, understanding how genotype relates to safety and efficacy. And it becomes a great tool to then measure where we could apply those therapies, as yet kind of almost another diagnostic to say, okay, we know this genotype really responds well to the drug, or this genotype, there's more safety risk. It provides another lens around, who would best benefit from these therapies. So I think that it's going to certainly be a key pillar of drug development in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Dr. Longmire, for your informative presentation. Um, do you have any final comments for our audience?
No, just excited to have the time with you today. If you're, certainly, if you want to visit the Medable website, we have a white paper on the study I was referencing from Tufts. I think it's probably one of the most robust analyses of decentralized clinical trials to date. Unfortunately, the white paper has a fairly limited look into the data, but the peer-reviewed paper is forthcoming and would be, happy to provide anyone that's available. If you want to email me, michelle@medable.com. But excited to have the opportunity to speak with you today, and thank you for your phenomenal questions.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Longmire, for your time today and your important research. Before we go, I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today and for their interesting questions. Questions we did not have time for today and those submitted during the on-demand period will be addressed by the speaker via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. This webcast can be viewed on demand for 2 years until February 2024. LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, goodbye.